今、黄金のマスクがよみがえる。パーソナルワークステーション X68000。
Hey everybody, welcome back to Video So today we're going to continue the series on the Sharp X68000, my favorite games to play on it. I'm sure pretty much all of you know by now you're watching Final Fight. And while I have done a video on this game maybe 4 years ago, it definitely deserves a re-review for the Sharp X68000. And there's a very interesting story about the Sharp X68000 and the CPS Capcom arcade system that'll be fun to talk about. Before we get too far involved, though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, you got a Patreon link down below as well. But Final Fight is one of the most famous arcade beat-em-ups of all time. It is Hall of Fame first ballot good, and playing it again on the Sharp X68000 is as good as playing it anywhere else you possibly could imagine. Now obviously this game first came out on the Capcom CPS, and then it was produced for the X68000, but this computer, the Sharp X68000, was basically the software development kit and development hardware for Capcom to make those CPS games. Unfortunately, none of that SDK seems to ever exist anymore. I've been looking around for a while just to see if I could get my hands on it, and I found absolutely nothing. But when you played all those classic Capcom arcade games back in the day, they were pretty much all developed on a variant of the Sharp X68000. Now there may be some custom boards there to get a little bit of an arcade pivot over for controls, but for the most part a stock X68000 was extremely close to a Capcom CPS arcade board, and that is just fun, and that's why you get such an incredible near to arcade perfect port on the Sharp X68000. And again, this is just an iconic game. As we go through the subway here, as all the enemies come, Roxy, Poison, Axel, and Andori, those are some of the most famous enemies in Capcom history, and Mike Haggart is definitely a Capcom champ. And there is even recently-ish a conversion to the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive of the arcade version with the Genesis hardware, because that also shared some similarities with the Capcom CPS. Just a fun little aside there. But this again is just one of those games. It is classic arcade gaming and classic retro gaming in a nutshell, and it really got its life started on the X68000, and for the longest time had the best port on this system unless you owned an original arcade board. Obviously now with stuff like MiSTer FPGA and software emulation, playing the Capcom CPS original is definitely the arcade perfect way, but I still think the Sharp X68000 is probably the best port ever of this game outside of re-releases on modern consoles where it's just emulation in the background anyway. Getting this at home would have felt so special back in the 90s because it was basically the arcade in your home. In a lot of ways, the Sharp X68000 was the Neo Geo of its generation for Capcom. SNK had the Neo Geo and brought all those arcade games home. Capcom had the Sharp X68000. They basically treated that like their Neo Geo. There's so many awesome Capcom CPS ports I could have talked about on this computer, but honestly for me, when I think about Capcom and the Sharp X68000, my mind immediately goes to Final Fight. I remember the first time I played this game, it was in a ski resort that I grew up in at the Cortina Inn. Downstairs outside of the restaurant in a bar, there was a cabinet for Final Fight in the game room next to an air hockey machine, and I put so many quarters into that thing because my father was a bartender there on weekends. I would hang out, he would give me quarters, and I would play the ever-loving hell out of Final Fight. And don't think it's weird, it was the 90s and it was mostly a restaurant with a bar in it. The weird part was my father was a medical doctor and liked to bartend on the weekends. Never made sense, total aside, but that is my history with Final Fight. I discovered it at a ski resort in Vermont, and I have been playing it ever since. I beat it back then in the arcades through sheer force of will and the pocket change my father would give me, which always seemed to be endless, but by the time I was done, all I wanted to do is go back and play all over again. This is one of those games I've been playing for basically 3 decades, and I have never gotten bored with it. And of course, as you can see here, you can bring a friend, you can do second player, it works great on the Sharp X68000. And even though this game is old, it is definitely aged, graphically this is still stunning, and the conversion here on the X68000 is so close to the arcade original. All of the background, all of the color, the fact that Capcom hates vehicles and wants them to die, it is 100% come over to the X68000, like 99% as good as the arcade. And with the Sharp X68000 sound hardware, it also sounds spectacular. Go ahead and listen for like 45 seconds and I'll be back with more game. That soundtrack is still some of the most iconic stuff as far as arcade games is concerned, in my opinion, and it totally holds up here on the X68000. And again, as we wander into this bar, it's just such a fun game. That neon kind of green in the background, almost going off towards like a grasshopper green. All of the bar patrons just standing there watching this fight. The bartender reading a newspaper and shaking his head. It is just a lot of fun, and I love that all the patrons don't really move. It does not matter that there's a 4-person brawl going on the floor. It doesn't matter if Hagar just got stabbed in the ribs with a knife. They really don't care. They're not going to ruin their nights, and why should they? It's just always a fun thing in beat 'em up games when there's all these static sprites and nobody reacts to the fact that there's a giant fight breaking out right in front of them. And I love this little area too. You think you're just going to go right through to the end, but of course Andore here comes up from behind, grabs you by the throat, and just walks you out. Apparently there was an underground fighting ring under the bar the whole time, and that definitely makes sense. A seedy bar in a back alley where people don't care that you're fighting, they're totally going to have unlicensed fighting in the basement where they can bet on it. If I found that bar in real life, I would go downstairs and bet on the fights too. And maybe like 18 years ago, Video Game Esoterica was in Eastern Europe and actually did get invited downstairs to bet on unsanctioned bare knuckle fights. You never know what I get up to back in the day. But short of that random aside, Hagar here has won his matches and he's going to the back alley to continue his fight. I will say every once in a while those cars there in the background definitely don't look correct, even on Capcom CPS hardware. Sometimes the sort of aspect of what you're looking at can get a little bit shrunk or stilted, but otherwise so much fun. And Eddie E here is the start of the cheapness in the bosses. If there's one thing I would say that drives me a little bit nuts about Final Fight is sometimes the bosses just do not want to let you anywhere near them. We have Eddie down to 1 hit, that's all I need to do, and then of course he calls in 3 enemies while he's shooting his 6-shooter across the screen. You will lose lives in this game just trying to get across the screen on bosses. The minute you get there, he takes that firearm out and just 100% unloads it into you again. This is definitely a port of an arcade game, and an arcade game is designed to make sure it gives you enough of a challenge so that you leave plenty of your quarters behind. But the one area in the game which I think just does not serve the game whatsoever is this next screen here. You're going to see these fire flames coming up from the grates. You have to avoid them or you're going to get burnt. In this area, they continually come towards you, the screen does not advance, and you need to actually fight opponents while you're here. If you get grabbed in the wrong spot, if you stand in the wrong spot, if you don't jump at the right time, you are going to take damage. I would say that there's one design flaw in the entirety of Final Fight, it is right here. But it does have a great soundtrack for this level, which more than makes up for it. 30 more seconds and I'll be right back. Capcom always made a great soundtrack, and Final Fight definitely is no exception. It's up there in probably like the top 5 soundtracks of my opinion as far as Capcom is concerned. And I make this joke every beat 'em up video. It's not a true beat 'em up, but there's not an elevator level, and Final Fight has you covered with this outdoor scaffolding that you go up and try to fight Relento in, someone you would see in other Capcom games moving forward. And I will say this is probably the most challenging boss in the entire game in my opinion. Once you get him down below half a health bar, he is just going to sprint back and forth across the screen, trying to make sure you cannot catch him. You will go through 1 to 2 lives trying to trap him in a corner. You can sometimes stun lock him on the edge, but it is very difficult to do, and you'll see here, I am just dying over and over again, trying to get this last little bit of damage off him. His health bar is completely red. All I need to do is touch him once, but he will not sit still, and that can absolutely drive you nuts when you're trying to just get that last hit in. I even had a grapple there, but he managed to throw a grenade while I was holding on to him. It blew up in my face, and of course I took more damage. Just 1 hit and that's all I need, but I'm definitely going to go through some lives here trying to get that last kick in. So if there's one complaint I have about Final Fight is that sometimes the bosses just are definitely cheap, but of course you broke a car, why not break some glass in a factory at the same time? I love that Capcom puts these little mini games in that serve no purpose other than a slight diversion. I love that Rope-a-Dope Hagar there just got hit in the face with a pane of glass. Obviously if you're doing 2-player games, you are challenging each other to try to get the most points here, but in a 1-player experience, as long as you get them all broken before the timer runs out, then you get a perfect score there. But Final Fight is just one of those games. Pretty much everyone has played it, but it's fun to talk about it all the same. And considering that this game for the arcades was developed on the PC it was ported to, it is a fun history lesson on just how the Capcom CPS games got made. And tell me down below, I'd be curious the first time you played Final Fight and what you thought of it. But I'll be back next week with our X68000 videos, and unfortunately there should have been a pet the dog button in this game, 0 out of 10 score, because I can't pet the puppy. Bye bye.